He promised to deliver the naked truth about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. In the end, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's speech before the Turkish parliament did accuse, saying there were orders from on high over the disappearance 3 weeks ago of the Saudi journalist when Khashoggi walked into his consulate in Istanbul. Erdogan arguing it was premeditated and calling for the 15-man hit squad and 3 others to be tried on Turkish soil. The Turkish president, though, refraining from openly blaming the Saudi crown prince. What else does Turkey know? How much in the end does Erdogan tighten the screws on its regional rival, one that's soldiering on? Saudi Arabia opening its so-called Davos in the Desert Economic Forum this Tuesday. There, big-name political leaders and CEOs are conspicuously absent amid the outrage over Khashoggi. But, like the Turks, if you put aside the suspension of German arms sales to Riyadh, politicians and companies loath to cut the cord completely. Many still represented. Take the U.S. Treasury Secretary. He won't be going to the summit himself, but Steve Mnuchin still made the trip out to talk to the king and the crown prince, which leaves all wondering about the lasting impact of the brutal murder of Khashoggi on what impact on Saudi Arabia, and also the amount of influence its oil money can buy. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the pressure on Saudi Arabia. Joining us from Istanbul, France 24 contributor Borzu Daragahi. Nice to see you.
Always a pleasure.
From the European Parliament in Strasbourg, Dutch Liberal member of the European Parliament, Mariette Schaake. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
Economist Younes Belfella teaches at the University of Toulouse 3. Welcome to the show. And from Washington, he's a former Washington Post Middle East bureau chief, Thomas Lipman of the Middle East Institute, the author of Saudi Arabia on the Edge, The Uncertain Future of an American Ally. Welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be with you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Recep Tayyip Erdogan making painstaking efforts to appeal to the king, never mentioning Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman by name in his speech before the Turkish parliament. Otherwise, though, Erdogan coming awfully close to throwing the book at the Saudis.
The information and the evidence that we have collected so far indicate that Jamal Khashoggi was brutally assassinated. Going forward, we expect the Saudi government to bring all those responsible to justice and punish them accordingly. There are indeed strong indications that the incident was not an accident that broke out unexpectedly on site, but rather the result of a planned operation.
Borzu Dargahi, that's not all he said. He said the Saudi administration's taken an important step by admitting to the murder. From now on, we expect him to cover all those responsible for this matter from top to bottom. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, Recep Tayyip Erdogan today, he did not reveal anything startling. He did not, for example, confirm, as some people expected he might, the existence of audio or video recordings that capture Jamal Khashoggi's final moments. But it was just another piece in unraveling the Saudi explanation for this. And if you think about it, the Saudi explanation for this was the admission that they made. Basically, what they're saying is that we were trying to, illegally kidnap a human being from another country and bring him back to Saudi Arabia, and it went wrong. I mean, in a way, their explanation it exceeded a lot. But what Recep Tayyip Erdogan at this point is trying to do is to push it further, try to get the Saudis to admit, for example, who was responsible for this operation, who ordered it, and who was involved in the planning and the carrying out of this operation.
Who is responsible? We've spent, Borzu, the last 3 weeks trying to think of someone who could not be Mohammed bin Salman.
I mean, that's basically the Saudi explanation. The Saudi explanation is that this was an operation, a rogue operation that was carried out with the knowledge and planning of people very, very, very close to Mohammed bin Salman, who have since been dismissed. ordered, they ordered these 18 guys to come to Istanbul and do this, and those 18 now have been arrested. And I think that definitely does not suffice for Turkey. It definitely doesn't suffice even for the Europeans and some members of the U.S. Senate and Congress.
Marietta Shaka, who else but Mohammed bin Salman could have ordered this?
Well, I think it is clear that not much can happen without his approval in the kingdom. And I also think this whole explanation of a kidnap and attempted torture gone rogue is fascinating, because what would have been, quote unquote, the normal consequence of him coming home and being tried for speaking his mind? I think about Raif Badawi, a blogger who called for democracy and secularism. He's a liberal, and he was punished with flogging and is in jail until today. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, people are beheaded with swords as a normal kind of punishment for homosexuality or atheism. So, I mean, the context here is very important. I don't believe it could have happened, such an operation, about which we hear more and more facts coming out and see more and more lies of Saudi authorities, proven. And, it is very important. We've also stated today here in a debate in the European Parliament that those who have perpetrated this brutal murder on a journalist will have to be held to account. And we are pushing for human rights sanctions and other kinds of accountability mechanisms, because this must have consequences.
Must have consequences. Your thoughts on Recep Tayyip Erdogan, how far he went in his speech?
Well, I think the direct accusation of premeditation was, not shared before. And if we look at the numbers of new illustrations of what actually happened, new images being brought out in the Turkish press, it may well have been a signaling to the Saudis, giving them an opportunity to come forward with more acknowledgements of their deeds, and perhaps that was what the president was doing. In any case, what we have called for is the need for an independent investigation, echoing what UN experts have said, because if this remains a matter of, two countries, Turkey and Saudi, that are also both stakeholders in one way or another, there will always be questions about whether the actual facts have been uncovered. So I think it is important that there is an international independent investigative team that joins the Turkish authorities and that starts to get to the bottom of this heinous crime.
Thomas Lippman, it's been 3 weeks since Jamal Khashoggi walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The pressure has not relented in that time. Does that surprise you?
Well, it surprises me only in its intensity and in the worldwide scope of the interest, because what you have now is a situation in which the Turks have multiple agendas. The Saudis are trying to cover the Crown Prince's tracks. And the United States is in a mildly uncomfortable situation. But you have to remember that the pressure on the Saudis is not coming from the president or the Secretary of State of the United States. And we haven't yet heard from the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, who's in Istanbul. But the United States and Saudi Arabia have been economic and strategic partners for 75 years. And in those 75 years, the United States has never, not once, put the relationship on the line over any human rights issue or the fate of any individual. So what will happen at the end of this is whoever does the investigation, regardless of the fate of Mohammed bin Salman, the fundamental working relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia will remain in place.
And the U.S. has its back. Your reaction to those images we saw earlier of Jamal Khashoggi's son and his brother, Salah and Sahel, meeting at the royal palace with the Saudi king and the crown prince, offering their condolences. You talked about Thomas Lippman. Your thoughts on that encounter that took place this Tuesday as that investors conference was opening?
Well, did they want to go to prison or did they want to do what they were told? That's what I think.
Yeah, the son who reportedly is not allowed to leave the country these days. What's going to happen to the Khashoggi family?
Well, look, there's a prominent Saudi dissident who's been here, living here in Washington, criticizing the regime for many years. They have persecuted everyone in his family. And that was long before Mohammed bin Salman came on the scene. People are understandably concerned and constrained in their desire or their ability to speak out if they still have family inside the kingdom, because the Saudis have demonstrated that if they can't get you, they'll get your brother or your mother or your child.
Among those, by the way, in attendance at that investors conference, we saw some early footage of the Crown Prince, MBS, seated next to the King of Jordan, and 2 seats down to the left of, you might see it there, you see him in those pictures, Walid bin Talal, the billionaire prince, among those sequestered for nearly 3 months at the end of last year at the Ritz-Carlton by Mohammed bin Salman. Your reaction when you look, Yunus Belfila, at those images of seeing Walid bin Talal at the opening of that Davos in the Desert conference?
I think it's just a political signal to say to all the world that the Saudi family deal with the crisis, and so the family can continue in the economic programs, okay, like the vision of 2030, and making this conference without the presence of European and also for the businessmen from United States. I think now the problem of Saudi Arabia is how we can deal with this crisis. Okay, starting the crisis by ignoring the situation, after talking about making easy the situation, okay, and after talking about an internal crisis, okay. But the problem now, I think, it's the political behavior of Saudi Arabia, because for all the analysts and the researchers say that in these 2 years, we say that we're in Yemen, blockers with Qatar, kidnapping the prime minister in Lebanon, making a diplomatic crisis with Germany and Canada. All these factors can impact the image of Saudi Arabia and impact also the political stability in Saudi Arabia. So for this reason, I don't know, Saudi Arabia can change the situation in the future. And now the question is, what is the future of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, with this crisis, okay?
And you think his future might be in doubt? That he may...
I think now we talk about the future about Mohammed bin Salman, because this is the man who make all these changes in the last few years in Saudi Arabia. It's the responsible of the war in Yemen, and also someone who monopolize all the power, okay, and the vertical power in the country. So all these elements impact the image of Mohammed Salman, like a new leader, like a new generation of leaders from Saudi Arabia in the world. Okay.
You agree with that, Borzo Daragahi, that MBS could lose his place over this?
MBS could very well lose his position as crown prince. It could happen. I don't know. I mean, this is something that's going to be decided internally. What is for sure is forget about this image of the crown prince as this modernizing reformer. Forget about his Vision 2030, because now it's more like Vision 1090. That was the year that the Hashashin, the assassins, were established. His image has been so tarnished in the international media. You're never going to get these sort of CEOs coming back. You're never going to get a meeting with Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. You're never going to get people in Hollywood sort of hanging out with him like just a few months ago, hanging out with US politicians and cultural leaders and so on. Just accepting money from Saudi Arabia for cultural and educational institutions is going to be a kind of red line for many organizations in the coming months and years. And it's going to be very hard. Saudi's going to have to decide, do we want MBS or do we want to try to rebrand ourselves yet again?
Marietta Shaka, yeah, most of those CEOs decided not to come, but some did. like the boss of French oil giant Total, who's got a contract to sign. Do you see this as blowing over?
Well, I really wonder what is the big difference now compared to all those other human rights violations in the past. And I'm happy that the brutal murder of Mr. Khashoggi, despite the gruesome facts, might lead to a wake-up call for those who still needed it. Because I think this whole hanging out and wishful thinking about what MBS might bring in terms of reforms is at such a contrast of the facts that we have seen for so long. I mean, in the weeks that the women were finally allowed to drive, the women's rights activists were put in prison. The war in Yemen sees 8 million people on the brink of starvation. We need to really see Saudi Arabia for what it is. And I don't really understand why this would not be a turning point in Washington. If this isn't, then what is? So I really look to leaders in Congress to show that the murder of Khashoggi needs to have consequences. And I agree that the reputation of the kingdom has been damaged. I think it will be very, very difficult to repair. But I think it was high time that a more realistic view of Saudi Arabia, its exporting of extremist theory and practice to Europe, its role in the region, is seen for what it is.
All right, when we come back, we're going to pick up on what Thomas Lippman said earlier about the current administration in Washington being, quote, mildly uncomfortable. Just how much pressure can Washington bear, and just how much influence can Saudi oil money buy? Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking as the pressure mounts on Saudi Arabia 3 weeks after the disappearance and murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who'd been a contributor to the opinions page of the Washington Post. Talking with us about it, Borzu Daragahi, who joins us from Istanbul. Welcome back as well. To Dutch member of the European Parliament, Marietta Schaake, from Washington. He's formerly of the Washington Post. Thomas Lippman of the Middle East Institute, the author of Saudi Arabia on the Edge, the Uncertain Future of an American Ally. And here in the studio, economist Younes Belfella, who teaches at the University of Toulouse 3 and who works on economies in the Arab world. We were talking about influence, oil money, Germany distancing itself on Sunday from its second biggest market for arms exports.
First, we condemn this act in the strongest terms, as we made clear yesterday. Secondly, there is an urgent need to clarify what's happened. This is far from having been cleared up and those responsible held to account. Thirdly, I agree with all of those that say arms exports, albeit already limited, can't take place in the current circumstances.
Now, on Monday, we heard noises the Canadians were considering following suit, but in the past hours, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau warning it would be very hard to scrap a 2014 arms deal with Riyadh worth up to $13 billion. Trudeau says the sale of light armored vehicles involving a Canadian unit of U.S. weapons maker General Dynamics includes stiff penalties for taxpayers should Canada withdraw. Your reaction, Marietta Schaake?
I don't know how it works there, but I think oftentimes sanctions are an exception to contracts. So I would hope that political judgment and principles that we know so well to be in high esteem by the Prime Minister of Canada will prevail here. Because if you look at the irrational behavior and lie after lie after lie after lie coming from Riyadh over the past couple of weeks, it is entirely irresponsible to sell war weapons to this country, to these authorities. And I think that it is very good that Chancellor Merkel has taken the lead. And I would have preferred to see an EU-wide embargo, which is something that we have called for in the European Parliament repeatedly already, especially in the context of the war in Yemen. So I hope, again, we will reach a turning point here and we'll see more rational behavior. And at least we will cease to export instability to Saudi Arabia. and a weapon embargo, but also an embargo on selling surveillance equipment with which dissidents and journalists are being tracked and traced in the kingdom is also absolutely appropriate. And then lastly, we would also call for human rights sanctions, meaning that those individuals who are responsible for this brutal murder will be individually held to account. Visa bans, we can see asset freezes, so that there's no more, fun time shopping in Paris or putting yachts in Nice or children in good European universities. There have to be consequences for the individuals that are responsible, and the impunity with which violations have been taking place, human rights violations that were serious before this murder for a very long time, it has to stop.
Younes Belfala, let me ask you, because we've seen public campaigns in Germany, in the UK, to a lesser degree here in France, against the war in Yemen.
Yeah.
When you see the position the Germans have taken, why have the French not taken a similar position yet?
I think for the French it's so complicated because the French army participate indirectly in this war by selling army for Emirates, Abu Dhabi, and also for Rafale for the Saudi Arabia, and the French position is to have a balance in this region between Saudi Arabia and also Iran in the Yemen. But I think the problem now for the Saudi Arabia is question of leadership in this region. With Mohammed bin Salman, we can't talk about Saudi Arabia like a leader of the Arab world, like a leader of Gulf region to meet the Iranian extension in this region. And this is the most important problem of Mohammed bin Salman, how he can promote this image of someone who can lead, who can make trust a relationship with all the partners in the Arab world and also in Europe. Because when we talk about Germany is one of the most important business partner of Saudi Arabia. But now the relationship is too bad, and we can talk also after this crisis of the journalists about the power games between Saudi Arabia and the United States, and also between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Okay, in the future, how we can deal with this economic relationship and the rule position in the Middle East.
All right. First of all, reactions coming in on the hashtag F24 debate. This one, what the world is witnessing is Turkey attempting to cash in on this gross crime. At some point, the governments of Saudi Arabia and Turkey will agree on a dollar number. Money will be wired, and Erdogan will end his campaign against MBS. Borsuz Argahi, is that how it's going to really play out?
I mean, I do think that there is a sort of a geopolitical calculation that Turkey is taking into account as it proceeds with this whole process. But I don't think that they can be bought off on this one. I think they want more than just money. I think, first of all, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the founder of an Islamist-rooted party, feels a bit of sympathy for Jamal Khashoggi, a Islamist-leaning journalist and intellectual who is of Turkish as well as Arabic ethnic origins. I think there is a personal stake here. And I also think that Turkey and the Turkish leadership sees an opportunity. And it's not about money, it's about geopolitical positioning, it's about protecting its ally Qatar, it's about avoiding what they consider a cataclysmic possible war with Iran that the Saudi leadership seems to be not that opposed to. And to do that, to accomplish all these goals, one of the things that they would like to do is to take out MBS. And that would be a prize that Erdogan would like. Would Turkey pursue this path if that wasn't a possibility? Maybe, maybe not. But I think that that is definitely a calculation.
Definitely a calculation. Thomas Lippman, I want to get back to...
I think there's also another calculation.
Go ahead, Marietta Shaka.
I mean, Turkey is not exactly, the world class of press freedom itself. And so to be seen as standing for the rights of a journalist and standing against his brutal murder is also allowing it to sort of be on the moral high side this time, in a circumstance where normally Turkey is actually being called out for violating not only human rights in general, but certainly also press freedom specifically.
Yeah, I just want to get back with Thomas Lippman to what we were talking about earlier, which is the suspension of those arms sales and the reaction of Canada. And because back in August, Saudi Arabia, Thomas, wound up expelling Canada's ambassador, freezing trade. It started with a tweet from the Canadian Foreign Ministry, which was addressing some of what Mariette has been talking about. Arrests of civil society and women's rights activists, including Samar Badawi. We urge the Saudi authorities, they said at the time, to immediately release them all and other peaceful human rights activists. And then what ensued was a deep freeze in relations, Thomas Lippman. And yet, here we are today, despite it all, hearing the Canadian Prime Minister saying he's not in favor of suspending the sale of those arms to Saudi Arabia.
Well, look, there's a strong argument to be made. I know it's being made here in Washington, and I assume it's being made in Ottawa as well, that the sale of security equipment, weapons, surveillance equipment, whatever you want to call it, to Saudi Arabia is not simply a transaction in commodities, that it's done in our own national security interests. The Saudis are very important to the United States, and I assume to the Canadians, in providing intelligence about the Islamic State and terrorist activities and Al-Qaeda and other malign organizations, in the confrontation with Iran, which the American administration equates with the Saudis as our most important priority in the Middle East, the maintaining of the sea lanes in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, that all those are interests in security interests that we have in common with Saudi Arabia. And the argument is that the more the Saudis can do in their own defense or power projection, the less we have to do for them.
Less we have to do for them. And it brings us back to what you were saying earlier about the current administration in Washington being mildly uncomfortable over the whole crisis. Donald Trump feeling the pressure to act, but loath to distance himself from one of his closest allies, as you've just pointed out. Let's hear more now from Emerald Maxwell.
Saudi Arabia has promised to retaliate if sanctions are leveled against it, a threat that Donald Trump seems to have taken to heart. As the world's largest oil exporter, Riyadh could send prices soaring if it decides to cut production. But the Saudi kingdom actually has less clout in the US economy than in the past. In 2003, it was the country's largest supplier of petroleum, but it made up less than 12% of imports last year, as fracking and renewables increased the United States' domestic energy production. With its vast oil fields to protect, though, and an ongoing war in Yemen, Saudi Arabia is also the world's largest arms importer in terms of value, and more than half of its imports come from the US. Last year, Trump claimed to have signed a $110 billion defense deal with Riyadh, and US manufacturers who stand to benefit have reportedly expressed concerns about the impact of a freeze. But for the US economy as a whole, arms sales to Saudi Arabia make up just 0.1% of its worldwide exports. That doesn't mean sanctions wouldn't hurt either side, though. Saudi government money flows into many American companies, including Silicon Valley startups, as well as US universities and think tanks. Riyadh, meanwhile, is looking for more foreign investment in order to diversify its economy away from oil and address a high unemployment rate.
Thomas Lippman, your think tank, the Middle East Institute, announcing in the past days that it would no longer accept Saudi money. How much influence, after all this, can Saudi oil money still buy?
I think the most overrated phenomenon in Washington is this supposed Saudi clout that they bought with their money. Saudi Arabia has never had friends in Congress. It's been wildly unpopular with the American people since the September 11th, 2001 attacks. You name the country or the part of the world, there's a congressional caucus in support of it, except for Saudi Arabia. And so they can spend all the money they want on ineffectual public relations here in the United States. All you need to do is go back 2 years and look at the vote in Congress on the measure that would allow American citizens to sue the Saudi government over the terrorist attacks of 2001. The Saudis threw everything they had into opposing that measure, and it was passed in Congress by overwhelming majorities over President Obama's veto. This supposed clout that the Saudis have is a myth generated, I think, by the people that Saudi Arabia has on its payroll.
You agree with that, Borzu Daragahi?
Well, I mean, I think they do have influence. I think that Saudi Arabia has its allies in the U.S. But, I think, Mr. Lippman, whose work I've followed for decades and I really respect on this issue, is absolutely right. The Middle East Institute itself, which Mr. Lippman is associated with, they've been getting Saudi money, yet their analysts, they're not pro-Saudi. By any stretch of the imagination. The Independent, the newspaper that I work for, has a Saudi co-owner. And, if you look at our coverage, there's no sign whatsoever that we're in favor of Saudi Arabia. So there's, a lot of sort of myth about lobbying in general and lobbying in Washington. And I think that the Saudis do spend money, but I don't think that they get a lot for it if you look at their PR status right now.
Absolutely correct.
But Borzu, we saw in that report those images of Donald Trump on his first ever foreign tour as president in Saudi Arabia touching the orb.
I think that's more about Donald Trump than about the lobbying machine in Washington. I think Donald Trump is a unique character in U.S. history. He has a certain admiration for authoritarian systems, as has been said by numerous analysts. He has had past dealings with the Gulf, business interests there, and his son-in-law forged a rather special relationship with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And I think that somehow they were sold not by necessarily the Saudi lobby, but by others, into this sort of fantasy that, this Saudi, UAE, Egypt, Israel coalition can launch a new Middle East, and it's just not going to happen.
A reaction on the hashtag F24 debate. Everyone critiquing Donald Trump for his desire to keep America's relationship with Saudi Arabia intact. Let's be clear. Yes, you can do that, but you can't do that without acknowledging that this deeply troubling relationship existed long before he entered the White House, a point Thomas Lippman made earlier. Marietta Shaka, if you want to pressure Saudi Arabia, how much do you need the United States?
Of course, the United States is vital. And I'm not living in Washington. I come there often. I don't know what the alternative would be. In other words, how much less popular the Saudis would be if they did not spend those millions on their PR machine. But it is true that this quote-unquote special relationship has carried them a long way. This Davos in the desert with all these Western CEOs, including many Americans, including American administration officials. As it was mentioned, Mohammed bin Salman hanging out with cultural leaders, sports leaders. So the idea that Saudis are sort of legitimate and normal, not to be criticized, I do think is more, let's say, acceptable in Washington than it would be here in Brussels or in Europe. I have always advocated a more even-handed approach to Saudi Arabia and Iran. I think there's a lot of reason for criticism on both regimes. They're both doing a lot of damage in the region. And we're not selling arms for the right reasons to the Iranians. Why would we sell arms to the Saudis? I think it is high time that we wake up to the myths that are being told about what stability Saudi Arabia can bring, and that we at least do not let a so-called strategic relationship go at the expense of talking about human rights. If it is indeed such a strong relationship, certainly they would be able to handle a bit of discussion about human rights, and they would not, as we've seen with Canada, gone all out, completely overboard about one tweet. Come on now.
Marietta, November...
May I interject something?
Thomas Lippman.
May I interject? I think the previous speaker is insufficiently cynical. And here's why I say that. I was in Riyadh when Jimmy Carter went there as president in the late 1970s. Jimmy Carter made human rights the cornerstone of his foreign policy throughout the world, except in Saudi Arabia. When he got to Saudi Arabia, he was very deferential to the Saudis and didn't say anything about human rights. Why? because he wanted something from the Saudis that overrode that consideration, namely endorsement of the Sadat Peace Initiative and Camp David. He didn't get it, but that's what he wanted. There's always something that overrides human rights considerations.
So, Thomas Lippman, one of the considerations is the price of gas at the pump in the United States. I know there are midterm elections coming up where you are. Do you think there'll be more pressure from the Trump administration once election day has passed?
This is the phoniest argument in this whole roster of phony arguments. Gasoline is cheap in the United States. You ever buy gasoline in Europe? The price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States is approximately the same as the price of a gallon of milk. Furthermore, the Saudis don't control the international oil market. Beyond that, the Saudis can't cut production much because they can't afford it. They need the money from every barrel. That's the phoniest argument in this whole list.
Marietta Shaka, there's another date before the midterms, which is important. You mentioned Iran. November 4th is the date that those unilateral sanctions kick in from the United States, ending its involvement in the nuclear deal. Do you see Europe's resolve stealing when it comes to trying to find alternatives to get around those sanctions?
I'm sorry, I don't understand how that is related to the matter that we're discussing.
You talked about the balance. The EU wants a balance between Saudi Arabia and Iran. When it comes to the sanctions,
I do.
It's been something that's been talked about by the French president, by all the signers of the GCPOA. When it comes to...
Sure, but that's a different matter. I was talking about arms embargoes, and I was talking about generally a more even-handed approach, and I'm very glad that the politician in the panel is not the most cynical one, so that put a smile on my face. But certainly the EU is committed to honoring the JCPOA, and I think that that's unrelated, frankly, to all the tensions that we see now around the aftermath of not only the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but also the lies that have been told, and the complete recklessness that doesn't correspond with the image of, leadership and reforms that has been churned out from Riyadh. So. Indeed, I think we need a more even-handed approach, but don't forget, a large part of my colleagues here in the European Parliament are very happy to take sort of the American approach of strategy and other considerations, strategic concerns above all. So it is not a given that my colleagues in this House agree with me, to be frank. I think the times
Marietta,
are changing now.
I would disagree that the Iran issue doesn't have anything to do with what's happening with Jamal Khashoggi. I think it's sort of the sort of underlying issue that has made the Trump administration so adamant about defending MBS, about believing the Saudi stories as they come out, because they feel that they really need Iran to make the sanctions work, to keep this sort of broad coalition in the Middle East against Iran work as November 4th approaches and beyond.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there because unfortunately we're out of time.
No, I agree in the U.S., but not in Europe.
Not in Europe. Okay, that'll be the final word. Marietta Shaka, thank you so much for joining us from Strasbourg. I want to thank Thomas Lippman in Washington, Borzo Daragahi in Istanbul, Eunice Belfella. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. James Creedon joins us.
Hi, Francois.
Yeah, so much to pack in.
That's right.
It was billed as the naked truth speech by Turkey's president before Parliament this Tuesday.
There's something darkly cinematic about the whole thing, the teasing, the build-ups, the suspense aspect, and it really is like a...
First rule of journalism, never oversell.
Gosh, well, it's like a Hollywood movie, a dark one. But anyway, a lot of people are talking today about the split screen, or the anticipation of there being a split screen moment between... Mohammed bin Salman speaking at the so-called Doha in the desert, and then Erdogan's speech on front of Parliament. Some saying, get ready for the Tuesday split screen. In the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, MBS takes to the stage to open a VIP-free Davos in the desert. Under suspicion, he ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Meanwhile, in Turkey, President Erdogan set to share his hashtag naked truth. Now, we didn't necessarily get the hashtag naked truth, but I'll give you some of the reactions. So this is Christopher Dickey, of course, often invited on The World This Week, every week, right? And he said Erdogan on Khashoggi has predicted a fig leaf on the promised naked truth, including deferential references to King Salman, custodian of the two holy mosques. No gory details. So perhaps it was oversold in some respects. No talk of the famous but unheard of recordings of Jamal Khashoggi's death. So a lot of this stuff was leaked to the Turkish media. But Erdogan was between a rock and a hard place in some senses, because if the embassy was bugged, and if these recordings came out in that way, and not by an Apple Watch or whatever we were being told, then he obviously can't address that. He can't talk about embassies being bugged. That's in the domain of state secrets. So he said probably as much as he could say, as much as he wanted to say. Erdogan's apparent attempt to divide King Salman, this is a New York Times commentator, from his favourite son, may be the most interesting element of his speech. So the speech perhaps used really with a very precise aim, which is to divide.
Yes, he appealed to the king, but didn't mention MBS by name.
That's right. That was noted by many. This is another comment in the same vein. This is the most important takeaway from the speech. Erdogan lets the Saudis know that he has evidence, but holds on to it, that he will not drop the case, but keeps the door open to the Saudis in the hope that King Salman will take action. He will need a smoking gun to really test this approach. Anyway, lots more to say on that, but certainly a lot of analysts saying that this is oddly very much positive for Erdogan in terms of his regional ambitions. Khashoggi case has put the Saudi prince right where Erdogan wants him, and this article goes into a lot of details about his regional ambitions, which were very much not the same as Riyadh's, and that I suppose Mohammed bin Salman's loss is Erdogan's gain in terms of geostrategy. Much more to say on that. And Iran, of course, silently observing all of this. This is an article on our own website in French talking about all aspects of that. So much more to say on it, Francois.
The Iranians keeping conspicuously silent.
Yes.
All right. Many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you, James. And thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Was it...